She felt the cold steel of the handcuffs tighten around her wrists. "Stop resisting," the officer barked. Jessica's chest burned with humiliation as the white customers watched, some smirking, others filming. Then a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Let her go!" What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. Jessica Carter stepped out of her black Tesla and adjusted her designer sunglasses. The late afternoon sun bounced off the car's polished black surface, casting fractured light across the sidewalk. The boutique stood at the corner of the street, its golden signage glowing under the sunlight. Large floor-to-ceiling windows framed the interior. Polished marble floors, soft lighting, and carefully curated displays of high-end handbags, shoes, and accessories. The kind of store where the price tags were discreet, but the message was clear. If you have to ask, you can't afford it. Jessica took a steady breath, her nails grazing the leather handle of her purse. This was a victory lap. She had closed the biggest deal of her career that morning, a multi-million-dollar contract that would not only elevate her company, but also cement her position as a dominant player in the industry. This store was a symbol of that success. She wasn't here to window shop. She was here to reward herself. Her heels clicked crisply against the polished marble floor as she stepped inside. The boutique was quiet, the kind of quiet that only wealth can buy. Soft classical music hummed through the air, blending with the subtle scent of fresh leather and imported perfume. The lighting was perfect, warm and carefully positioned to highlight the finest details of the handbags and shoes on display, the kind of luxury that whispered rather than shouted. Jessica's gaze swept the room with practiced ease. Two older white women near the sunglasses display murmured to each other, their diamond bracelets catching the light as they gestured toward the latest collection. A young influencer in designer athleisure posed in front of a mirror, angling her phone for the perfect shot. No one paid attention to Jessica, except for the saleswoman behind the counter. She was white, early 40s, with sleek blonde hair pulled back into a low chignon. Her blouse was cream silk, perfectly pressed, with a delicate gold necklace resting just below her collarbone. Her posture was poised, her smile polished, exactly what you'd expect in a store like this. But Jessica saw it the moment the woman's gaze landed on her. The smile evaporated. Her expression didn't harden outright. These places were too careful for that. But there was a flicker of tension in the tightening of her jaw, a subtle narrowing of the eyes. Jessica knew that look. The look that said, "What are you doing here?" Jessica was used to it. No matter how successful she became, how carefully she dressed, how many rooms she owned, there was always that look, that silent calculation. You don't belong here. Jessica didn't let it touch her expression. Her back stayed straight, her chin high. She walked toward the handbag display, her eyes landing on a sleek black leather purse beneath a spotlight. The stitching was flawless. Italian leather. Understated elegance. Jessica picked it up, feeling the softness beneath her fingertips. It was the kind of bag that spoke in quiet confidence, a piece that didn't have to prove itself because it already belonged. "Can I help you?" The saleswoman's voice was sharp beneath the politeness, the kind of tone reserved for people who might not be able to afford what they were holding. Jessica's eyes flicked toward her. The woman's smile was thin and tight. Her gaze hovered too long on the purse in Jessica's hands. "No, thank you," Jessica said evenly, turning the bag over in her hands to inspect the stitching. The craftsmanship was immaculate. Her grip tightened slightly. The saleswoman didn't move. Her eyes lingered a moment too long before she turned away. Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. This was exactly why she had pushed so hard to succeed, to reach a point where no one could question whether she belonged in places like this. But it never seemed to matter. Jessica inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She would not let this ruin her day. That was when she felt it. The shift in atmosphere. It was subtle. A change in the air pressure, a new weight settling over the room. The quiet hum of the store's music seemed to dull. The soft chime of the door opening. Jessica's eyes lifted. A police officer had stepped into the store. Tall, broad shoulders beneath a perfectly pressed uniform, buzzed blonde hair, pale blue eyes that scanned the room with cold efficiency. His utility belt sagged heavily at his waist, a firearm, handcuffs, a baton. His expression was hard and unreadable. Jessica's breath hitched. His gaze swept the room quickly, passing over the white customers without pause. Then his eyes landed on Jessica. His focus sharpened instantly. Jessica's chest tightened. The officer's gaze lingered on her hands, the purse she was holding. His body language shifted almost imperceptibly, but Jessica saw it. The subtle tensing of his shoulders, the way his hand drifted toward his belt. Jessica's fingers curled slightly around the bag's handle. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. The officer's gaze darkened. His eyes flicked toward the saleswoman behind the counter. The saleswoman didn't speak, but Jessica caught the quick dart of her eyes toward the officer and then back toward Jessica. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear enough. Jessica's jaw tightened. Her grip on the purse steadied. The officer took a step closer. His boots scraped against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the ambient noise of the boutique. Jessica forced herself to remain still, to keep her breathing even. She knew how this worked. She had seen it before, heard the stories. When someone like her, in a place like this, got too comfortable, the assumption was always the same. Her pulse hammered beneath her skin. The officer's eyes narrowed. His gaze was cold, assessing. The hand near his belt flexed slightly. His body language spoke volumes even though he hadn't said a word. Jessica's stomach coiled. Her gaze flicked toward the other customers. A man near the sunglasses rack had noticed. His mouth curled faintly at the edges. A teenage girl near the perfume display was whispering to her friend. A young man standing near the front of the store lifted his phone and tilted it slightly toward Jessica, as though preparing to record. Jessica's breath sharpened. The officer's stare didn't waver. His chest rose and fell in steady, even breaths. Jessica's eyes flicked toward the saleswoman again. The woman's gaze was sharp, her expression impassive. Jessica knew exactly how this would go. The officer didn't need to say anything. All it would take was a word from the saleswoman, a single accusation. The customers would side with the store. The officer would have the excuse he needed. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Jessica's gaze hardened. Her grip on the purse tightened. Her breath steadied. She wasn't leaving. The officer's eyes narrowed. A muscle in Jessica's jaw flexed. The air in the boutique was sharp and brittle, ready to break. Jessica's eyes remained steady, fixed on the officer's cold gaze. She wasn't backing down. Officer Bradley Johnson was tall and broad-shouldered, his buzzed blonde hair and sharp blue eyes giving him the cold, detached look of someone who had long stopped viewing people as individuals. His uniform was crisp, his utility belt heavy with the weight of authority, a holstered firearm, a baton, a set of metal handcuffs that glinted under the store's soft lights. His eyes narrowed with quiet calculation as he strode toward Jessica, his boots striking the marble floor with deliberate force. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing the handle of his gun, not overtly threatening, but calculated enough to send a message. Jessica's gaze sharpened, her body tensed. Years of navigating rooms where she wasn't welcome, of pushing through subtle and not-so-subtle forms of discrimination, had taught her to recognize the quiet language of threat. This was not a misunderstanding. "Ma'am," Bradley said, his tone measured, heavy with authority. "I'm going to need you to put that down." Jessica's brow furrowed. Her grip tightened slightly on the black leather purse. "Excuse me?" Bradley's eyes darkened. His gaze swept over her from head to toe, not in admiration but in assessment, like he was deciding how much of a threat she posed. His body language sharpened. "We received a report of suspicious activity," Bradley said. His voice was cold, professional, the type of tone used when the decision had already been made. Jessica's fingers curled tighter around the purse's handle. Suspicious activity? She was standing in a luxury boutique holding a designer bag. That was it. That was the whole crime. Jessica's jaw tightened. Suspicious activity? Bradley's expression didn't change. His hand hovered closer to his belt. His thumb brushed the edge of the handcuffs. His eyes stayed locked on hers, unblinking. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice colder now, the hard edge of a command beneath the surface. "Put the bag down." Jessica's pulse spiked. Heat crept up the back of her neck. The walls of the boutique suddenly felt closer. The soft classical music in the background seemed to fade beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her eyes flicked toward the saleswoman. The woman stood stiffly behind the counter, her hands resting delicately on the glass surface. Her gaze was calm, detached. Not once did she make a move to clarify the situation or defend Jessica. That was confirmation enough. Jessica's jaw clenched. "Did you call him?" The saleswoman's eyes flicked toward Bradley, then away. A subtle movement, so small it could have been dismissed as nothing. But Jessica knew better. She knew exactly how this worked. The tension in Jessica's chest sharpened into something hard and hot. Bradley stepped closer. His boots scraped against the marble. His shadow lengthened beneath the bright lights. The smell of leather and expensive perfume felt suddenly suffocating. "Put it down," Bradley said, his tone dropping into a sharp command. Jessica's anger flared. "Do you know who I am?" Her voice was steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. Bradley's lips curled into a thin smile. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile a predator gives right before it pounces. "Yeah," Bradley said, his voice low. "A thief." Jessica's breath hitched. A thief. Her nails dug into the soft leather of the purse. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She heard the quiet rustle of movement behind her. The other customers were watching now. A man near the sunglasses rack had turned toward them, his mouth curled in mild fascination. A young woman near the scarves had pulled out her phone. Jessica's throat burned. Humiliation swept over her in a wave. Her eyes snapped back toward Bradley. His smile remained thin and tight. His eyes, though, were sharp and predatory. He wasn't bluffing. He was ready. Jessica's breath quickened. Her thoughts raced. If she argued, it would escalate. If she resisted, it would escalate. And even if she complied, Jessica knew how these stories ended. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "I'm not stealing," Jessica said, her voice low and controlled. Bradley's smile remained unchanged. "We'll see about that." His hand brushed the edge of his cuffs. Jessica's gaze hardened. Her eyes flicked toward the saleswoman again. No help there. The woman's expression remained smooth, professional, unbothered. Jessica inhaled slowly through her nose. She could feel the weight of the customer's stares pressing down on her like a physical force. Judging, expecting. She was standing in a $1,000 dress, holding a $4,000 purse, and none of it mattered. All they saw was a black woman. All they saw was the possibility of guilt. Bradley's stance sharpened. His hand curled around his belt. "You're making a mistake," Jessica said. Her voice was sharp now, controlled but cutting. Bradley's smile thinned. "Funny," he said. "I was thinking the same thing." Jessica's spine stiffened. Her heart slammed against her chest. "I'm not going to ask again," Bradley said, taking another step forward. Jessica's pulse roared beneath her skin. Her grip on the purse remained firm. Her mind raced through the possible outcomes, none of them good. "You have no reason." Bradley's hand shifted toward the cuffs. "You're resisting," Bradley said flatly. Jessica's chest tightened. She forced herself to breathe evenly. A man near the shoe display whispered something to his friend. A teenage boy near the entrance lifted his phone higher. Recording. Bradley's stance widened slightly. His hand settled on the handle of the cuffs. Jessica's eyes sharpened. The heat beneath her skin threatened to boil over. She could feel the humiliation digging beneath the surface of her calm expression. The memory of every time this had happened before, every quiet accusation, every condescending look, every moment when her success and status didn't shield her from the weight of prejudice. Bradley's gaze remained cold. Jessica's grip on the purse tightened until her knuckles ached. "I'm not stealing," Jessica repeated, her voice dark and cold. Bradley's smile faded. His eyes darkened. "Put it down." Jessica didn't move. A sharp ripple of tension passed through the room. The teenage boy near the entrance was holding his phone steady now. Jessica could see the red recording light. Bradley's hand flexed around the cuffs. "You have 3 seconds to comply," Bradley said, his tone dropping into a hard edge. Jessica's breath quickened. Her gaze remained steady. The other customers were watching, leaning in as though waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Some looked fascinated, others mildly amused. Bradley's expression was stone. 1. Jessica's jaw tightened. 2. Her pulse roared in her ears. Her gaze locked with his. 3. Jessica's grip on the purse remained steady. She wasn't backing down. Bradley's hand closed around Jessica's arm like a vice, his fingers digging into her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. His grip was hard, calculated, controlled force disguised as restraint. He yanked her arm behind her back with enough pressure to make her shoulder twist painfully. Jessica's breath hitched as pain shot down her arm. "Hey!" Jessica shouted, twisting away instinctively. Bradley's grip tightened. His fingers dug into the soft skin of her forearm, a bruising pressure that made her wince. Her shoulders strained at an unnatural angle, a sharp pulse of discomfort radiating through her back. "Stop resisting!" Bradley barked. His voice cut through the boutique's soft classical music like a whip. Jessica's jaw clenched. Her body tensed with the familiar rush of fear and humiliation. "I'm not resisting," Jessica hissed, her breath sharp and ragged. Her eyes darted toward the saleswoman behind the counter. The woman's expression remained smooth and composed, her mouth a thin, impassive line. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Her hands rested delicately on the glass surface of the counter as if nothing unusual was happening. Jessica's pulse slammed against her ribs. She felt the weight of the other customer's eyes pressing down on her like a lead blanket. A white woman near the shoe display whispered something to her friend. The friend's mouth curled into a smirk. A man near the sunglasses rack pulled out his phone and started recording. Jessica saw the red recording light blinking. Her throat tightened. "You're making a mistake," Jessica said through gritted teeth, her voice low and sharp. She fought to keep her breathing steady even as her heart hammered painfully beneath her ribs. Bradley's mouth curled into a smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile a predator gives its prey when it knows the outcome is inevitable. "Am I?" he said. Jessica's stomach dropped. Her eyes burned as heat pressed behind them. Tears threatened to rise, but she forced them back. She wasn't going to cry, not here, not in front of them. She could feel the weight of the moment folding in on itself. Every single movement, every breath was being recorded, observed, judged. The humiliation of it carved into her chest like glass. Bradley's hand slid toward the cuffs on his belt. The metallic click of the handcuffs being unclipped from his belt sent a wave of ice through Jessica's veins. Jessica's throat tightened painfully. "I'm giving you one last chance to comply," Bradley said, his tone dark and dangerous. His grip on her arm tightened further. Jessica's breath hitched. Her body tensed. Her free hand curled into a fist at her side. She had never felt so powerless. Jessica had faced down boardrooms full of condescending men. She had built her career from the ground up in an industry that never expected someone like her to succeed. She had fought for every inch of respect, for every dollar she earned, for every seat at the table. And yet here she was, standing in a $1,000 dress, holding a $4,000 purse, and none of it mattered. Not her success, not her reputation, not her money. All they saw was a black woman. All he saw was a threat. The pressure on her arm increased. Bradley's hand slid lower, his fingers digging into the sensitive skin beneath her elbow. Her arm twisted painfully behind her back. Jessica's breath hissed through her teeth as her shoulder burned with the uncomfortable strain. A low murmur rippled through the store. A teenage girl near the scarf display was whispering to her friend, her eyes wide with poorly concealed fascination. A man in a suit near the shoe section had crossed his arms, his mouth curled in mild amusement. He wasn't going to intervene. None of them were. Jessica's gaze snapped toward the saleswoman again. Their eyes met. Jessica's expression sharpened. "Do something," Jessica said through her teeth. Her voice was low but seething. The saleswoman's eyes remained cool and detached. Her gaze flicked toward Bradley's hand on Jessica's arm, then back to Jessica's face. She didn't move. Jessica's stomach coiled in disgust. Bradley tugged on her arm, twisting it higher. "Stop," Jessica said. "Then put the bag down," Bradley said, his tone darkening. His grip tightened. Jessica's body tensed. A wave of anger surged beneath her skin, threatening to boil over. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But that didn't matter. Bradley's handcuffs clinked softly as he slid them free from his belt. Jessica's pulse roared in her ears. The teenage boy recording near the sunglasses rack held his phone steady. The red light blinked, capturing every humiliating second. Jessica's breath sharpened. "Let go of me," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the boutique. Bradley's hand didn't move. His grip tightened. Jessica's breath hitched. The man near the shoe display shifted, his mouth curled into a small smirk. He wasn't going to help. No one was. Jessica's jaw tightened. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, constricting her breathing. Her gaze sharpened beneath the heat burning behind her eyes. She could already hear the headlines in her mind. Successful black businesswoman arrested for theft in upscale boutique. Prominent CEO accused of shoplifting. Incident caught on camera. Public outrage expected. And even if she was cleared, the stain wouldn't fade. It would follow her, shadow her career, be weaponized by competitors and critics alike. Bradley's hand hovered near the cuffs. Jessica's pulse hammered painfully beneath her ribs. Her gaze darted toward the exit. Her chest tightened. Bradley's grip tightened further. The tension in her arm made her shoulder throb. Her breath sharpened. "Put it down." Jessica's gaze burned with anger. "I told you," Jessica said. Her voice was low, sharp. "I'm not stealing." "Then put it down," Bradley said. Jessica's jaw flexed. "Or what?" Jessica said. Bradley's eyes darkened. His handcuffs clinked as he adjusted them in his hand. Jessica's chest tightened painfully. Another sharp murmur swept through the store. The phone cameras were steady now. This wasn't just a scene, it was becoming a spectacle. Bradley's hand twitched toward the cuffs. Jessica's pulse hammered beneath her skin. "You're making a mistake," Jessica repeated. Her tone was hard now, controlled. Bradley's gaze didn't soften. "Am I?" Jessica's breath quickened. The walls of the boutique seemed to close in. She wasn't backing down. Her breath sharpened. Her pulse thundered. Her vision narrowed. Bradley's hand tightened around her arm. Jessica's gaze burned. The moment hung in the air, brittle and dangerous. Jessica wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of fear. Her grip on the purse remained steady. Her jaw clenched. Her breath slowed. Her eyes remained locked on his. She wasn't backing down. "Jessica Carter?" A deep voice sliced through the thick tension hanging in the boutique like a blade. Jessica's head snapped toward the entrance. An elderly black man stood just inside the door. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored navy suit that clung to his frame with effortless precision. A crisp white shirt and a gold tie pin completed the look. His salt-and-pepper hair was cropped short, and his neatly trimmed beard framed sharp, angular features. His eyes, dark and focused beneath thick furrowed brows, cut through the room with quiet authority. "Mr. Whitmore." Jessica's breath hitched. Relief flickered through her chest, but it didn't settle. The sting of humiliation was still fresh beneath her skin. "Mr. Whitmore!" Jessica gasped. Her voice cracked slightly from the pressure in her throat. Her chest burned from the sharp coil of emotion sitting there. Whitmore's gaze sharpened the moment he saw Bradley's hand locked around Jessica's wrist. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek flexing beneath the skin. His expression darkened, the quiet authority in his posture sharpening into something dangerous. Jessica could feel the shift in the room. The weight of Whitmore's presence tilted the balance instantly. His stillness carried more gravity than Bradley's entire display of force. "Let her go." Whitmore's voice was low and cold, measured. There was no rise in his tone, no obvious threat, just the kind of deadly calm that demanded obedience. Jessica saw the flicker in Bradley's expression, a flash of hesitation, but his grip on her wrist didn't loosen. His blue eyes darkened as his gaze flicked toward Whitmore, sizing him up with the detached calculation of a man used to being the highest authority in any room. Bradley's thumb brushed over Jessica's skin, a final deliberate pressure. His grip remained firm. His eyes sharpened with a quiet, simmering challenge. "Now," Whitmore said. His tone didn't change, but the command beneath it sharpened. Bradley's jaw flexed. Jessica felt the subtle tremor of tension running through his arm. His hand tightened slightly before it finally relaxed. Jessica stumbled back a step as Bradley's hand released her wrist. Her breath hitched as she rubbed at the sensitive skin where his fingers had been. A dull ache lingered beneath the surface. She steadied herself, pulling her shoulders back, her breath still ragged. Whitmore's gaze didn't move from Bradley. His eyes were cold, unyielding. "What's going on here?" Whitmore's tone was sharp, cutting through the brittle silence of the boutique. His posture remained controlled, but there was a lethal undercurrent beneath the surface. Bradley's eyes darkened. His chest rose and fell in steady, measured breaths. His hand hovered near his belt, his fingers brushing the edge of the handcuffs still hanging there. He wasn't backing down. "She was trying to steal," Bradley said, his tone flat, professional. But there was a defensive edge beneath the surface now, an instinctive reaction to having his authority questioned. Jessica's chest tightened. The heat beneath her skin sharpened into something hard and cold. Her jaw flexed. Whitmore's gaze darkened. A flicker of sharp, controlled anger passed through his expression. His lips thinned. "Jessica Carter," Whitmore said, his tone low and deliberate, "is one of the wealthiest business owners in this city." Jessica's pulse hammered beneath her skin. Her gaze flicked toward Bradley. Bradley's eyes narrowed. His jaw flexed beneath the weight of Whitmore's words, but his expression remained hard, detached. Whitmore took a step closer, His shoes barely made a sound against the marble floor, but the shift in proximity was deliberate. His presence pressed against the edges of the room. "Are you accusing her of stealing?" Whitmore's voice sharpened at the edges. His eyes didn't move from Bradley's. Bradley's mouth twitched. A shadow of uncertainty crossed his face. His gaze flicked toward the saleswoman behind the counter. Jessica's eyes followed. The saleswoman's hands were still resting on the glass surface of the counter. Her gaze remained steady, but Jessica caught the faint tension around her mouth, the slight rigidity in her posture. Whitmore's eyes sharpened. His gaze slid toward the saleswoman. "Did you call him?" Whitmore's tone was sharper now, cutting beneath the surface of the moment like a blade. The saleswoman's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted toward Bradley and back toward Whitmore. Jessica's breath hitched. The saleswoman started, but her voice faltered. Whitmore's gaze sharpened. "Answer the question," he said. The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flicked toward Bradley. Jessica saw it clearly now, the silent exchange, the unspoken complicity. The woman's eyes lowered. She didn't answer. Whitmore's mouth thinned. Bradley's jaw flexed. His fingers brushed over his belt again. A flicker of resistance sharpened in his eyes. "I responded to a report of suspicious activity," Bradley said. His tone was controlled but edged with quiet aggression. His gaze remained cold. "What suspicious activity?" Whitmore pressed. Bradley's mouth tightened. His gaze darkened. "She was holding a bag," Bradley said flatly. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. His expression sharpened with cold fury beneath the calm surface. "Let me be sure I understand this," Whitmore said slowly. His gaze locked onto Bradley's. "A black woman holding a purse is suspicious activity?" A ripple of tension passed through the room. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Bradley's expression didn't shift, but Jessica saw the tension beneath the surface. His jaw flexed. His eyes hardened. His fingers curled toward his belt. Whitmore didn't blink. His gaze remained hard and steady. "I'm going to give you an opportunity to reconsider your position," Whitmore said. Bradley's gaze sharpened. Jessica's breath quickened. The tension in the room pulled tighter, every molecule of air sharp and brittle. The teenage boy near the sunglasses rack was still recording. The red light on his phone's screen blinked steadily. Jessica could feel the weight of the other customers' gazes pressing down on her. The woman near the scarf display was frozen, her mouth slightly open. The man near the shoe section had folded his arms, his expression hovering between amusement and discomfort. Bradley's hand remained near his belt. His gaze stayed cold. "I was doing my job," Bradley said, his voice low. "Your job?" Whitmore repeated. His tone remained steady, but the cold edge beneath it sharpened. "Or a mistake?" Bradley's mouth curled faintly at the corner. Whitmore's gaze remained steady. His eyes sharpened. Jessica's pulse hammered painfully against her ribs. The ache in her wrist flared beneath the weight of Bradley's lingering presence. No one spoke. The boutique's soft background music seemed distant beneath the pounding of her heartbeat. Bradley's eyes stayed hard. His jaw flexed. Jessica's breath quickened. The silence stretched. Brittle. Heavy. Jessica's gaze burned. Her hands tightened at her sides. She wasn't backing down. Neither was Bradley. And neither was Whitmore. The air in the boutique remained tense and razor-sharp, suspended in the fragile balance of a conflict that hadn't yet reached its breaking point. Jessica's breath steadied. Her chest rose and fell in controlled, measured breaths. The sharp sting of humiliation still burned beneath her skin, but the intensity of it had hardened into something colder, sharper. Her gaze sharpened as the boutique's soft lighting reflected off the polished marble floor beneath her heels. She wasn't going to shrink beneath the weight of this moment. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of weakness. Her heels clicked against the floor with quiet precision as she strode toward the sales counter. The sound cut through the brittle silence hanging in the air. Jessica could feel the weight of every gaze in the store tracking her. Some curious, some amused, others cold and calculating. The tension pressed down like a thick fog. The black leather purse remained in her hand, the fine Italian leather cool beneath her fingertips. Her grip on it was steady. Her wrist still throbbed from the pressure of Bradley's grip, but she didn't let it show. Jessica stopped at the counter. The saleswoman stood rigid behind the glass display, her hands pressed flat against the surface. Her carefully polished exterior was beginning to crack at the edges. Jessica could see the slight tremor in her fingers. The saleswoman's gaze darted toward Mr. Whitmore, searching for guidance or permission. But Whitmore remained perfectly still, his expression cold and unreadable. Jessica lifted the purse slightly. "I'll take this," Jessica said. Her voice was low and cutting, every syllable sharpened to a perfect edge. The saleswoman's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Jessica could see the hesitation in her eyes, the quick, frantic calculation behind them. Is this a trap? Is she serious? Can I refuse? Jessica's lips curled faintly. "Actually," Jessica said, her tone turning razor sharp, "I think I'll buy the whole store." The boutique froze. Gasps rippled through the room like a wave. A soft, stunned murmur passed through the other customers. Jessica didn't have to turn to know they were staring. She could feel the shift in energy, the sudden inhale of disbelief as her words registered. Bradley's head snapped toward her. His eyes narrowed, his mouth twisting. "What?" Bradley's tone was flat, sharp with disbelief. Jessica's gaze remained steady. "You heard me," Jessica said. Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that made people nervous. "How much for the whole store?" The saleswoman's eyes widened. Her mouth trembled slightly. Her gaze flicked toward Whitmore, searching for an anchor. I'm not sure we can..." Jessica's hand slid into her purse. The cool weight of her phone settled into her palm. Her manicured nails flashed under the soft lighting as she unlocked it with a flick of her thumb. The screen glowed beneath her hand. Jessica's gaze didn't move from the saleswoman's face. "I'll wire the money right now," Jessica said evenly. A thin ripple of tension passed through the room. The saleswoman's breath quickened. Her gaze darted toward Whitmore again, but his expression remained neutral. Bradley's mouth curled faintly at the edges. His eyes darkened beneath the fluorescent light. "You can't be serious," Bradley said. His voice was low, mocking. Jessica's gaze sharpened. "You think I'm bluffing?" Jessica's tone was ice. Her thumb moved over the screen of her phone, tapping deliberately. The soft sound of the screen responding beneath her fingertips seemed amplified beneath the heavy silence pressing down on the boutique. Bradley's eyes narrowed. Jessica's expression remained smooth, controlled. Her thumb hovered over the final confirmation button. Her eyes remained locked on the saleswoman. "Well?" Jessica said. Her tone sharpened beneath the surface of the word. "Should I press it?" The saleswoman's mouth trembled. A thin sheen of sweat appeared just beneath her hairline. I'd need to check with..." "You won't," Whitmore said smoothly. The saleswoman's gaze whipped toward him. Her mouth opened slightly, but Whitmore's expression remained cold. "If she decides to buy the store," Whitmore said, You'll process the transaction. Jessica's gaze sharpened. Her thumb hovered over the screen. The final step, the edge of control balanced beneath her fingertips. "You're bluffing," Bradley said. His tone sharpened. His hand flexed near his belt, his stance widening. His blue eyes darkened. "You're not actually going to—" Jessica's gaze flicked toward him. "You don't think I can afford it?" Jessica's voice was soft, dangerous. Bradley's jaw tightened, his mouth twisted, his eyes sharpened with quiet aggression. "Go ahead," Bradley said, his voice low and cutting. His chin lifted slightly in challenge. "Press it." Jessica's finger curled toward the button. Her gaze didn't waver. A sharp pulse of tension pressed through the room. The teenage boy near the sunglasses display still had his phone raised. Jessica saw the red recording light blinking steadily in the reflection of the glass. The saleswoman's breath hitched audibly. Her hands curled slightly against the edge of the counter. Jessica's thumb brushed the edge of the screen. Whitmore's gaze remained steady. His expression didn't shift. Bradley's eyes burned beneath the cold surface of his face. Jessica's pulse hammered beneath her skin. Her breath sharpened. The silence in the boutique thickened. Jessica's gaze hardened. Her chest rose and fell in steady, controlled breaths. "I'm waiting," Jessica said softly. The saleswoman's mouth trembled. Her gaze darted toward Whitmore again. Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "You don't need to confirm anything," Whitmore said, his tone cold. "If Miss Carter chooses to make this purchase, you will process it." The saleswoman's jaw trembled. Her hands curled into fists. Bradley's mouth curled. His eyes flashed with quiet hostility. His hand flexed toward his belt. Jessica's thumb hovered over the screen. The weight of the moment sharpened. Suspense tightened around the edges of the room like a wire pulled too tight. Jessica's gaze locked onto the saleswoman's face. "Well?" Jessica said softly. The saleswoman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jessica's pulse hammered. The room felt too still, too sharp. Bradley's gaze burned into her profile. His mouth twisted into something dark beneath the surface of his expression. Jessica's gaze flicked toward him. Her lips curled faintly. "Scared?" Jessica asked. Bradley's jaw flexed. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Jessica's thumb pressed lightly against the screen, hovering just at the edge of the button. "I don't bluff," Jessica said. Her voice was soft, lethal. The room held stillness like the edge of a knife. The saleswoman's breath hitched. Bradley's hand curled toward his belt. Jessica's pulse hammered. Her thumb brushed the screen. The red recording light blinked steadily from the teenage boy's phone. Jessica's gaze remained sharp and steady. And then, she smiled. Not wide, not obvious, just a faint curl at the edge of her mouth. "I'm giving you a chance," Jessica said softly, her gaze cutting toward Bradley. "To walk away." Bradley's mouth tightened, his jaw flexed. The room remained thick with tension, balanced on the edge of Jessica's finger. The weight of control hovered there, just waiting to fall. Jessica's thumb remained steady. She wasn't bluffing, and they knew it. Bradley's face turned red. The deep crimson color spread across his neck and up to his ears, clashing violently with the pale blue of his eyes. His jaw tightened, and the muscle beneath his cheek pulsed dangerously. His chest rose and fell beneath the stiff weight of his uniform, each breath sharp and strained. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the tendons in his forearms tightening beneath the fabric of his sleeves. You can't be serious," Bradley said, his voice low and sharp, strained beneath the pressure of disbelief. His eyes burned with a dangerous light. His gaze darted between Jessica and Whitmore, searching for something, an opening, a weakness, a way to seize back control of the room. Jessica turned toward him slowly. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, Her heels made a soft, crisp sound against the marble as she shifted toward him. The black purse still hung from her arm, the leather catching the soft light beneath the overhead fixtures. Her expression was smooth and sharp, a carefully curated mask of detached control. Jessica's gaze lifted toward Bradley's face. Her chin tilted slightly upward. The sharp line of her jaw caught the light. Her eyes, dark and cutting, locked onto his with an unwavering steadiness that cut beneath the surface of his forced composure. "Officer Bradley," Jessica said, her tone smooth as glass but sharpened at the edges, the kind of voice that commanded rooms and sealed deals. "You are no longer welcome here." Bradley's eyes darkened, his breath sharpened, his chest tightened beneath the weight of her words. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hands flexed at his sides, the tension in his knuckles stark beneath the skin. "You can't do that," Bradley hissed. His voice sharpened beneath the surface of his composure, cutting toward her like a blade. His gaze flared with the kind of cold resentment that simmered beneath years of unchecked entitlement. Jessica's expression didn't shift. Whitmore stepped forward, his presence sliding effortlessly beside Jessica's like a wall of quiet, controlled authority. His tailored navy suit cut sharp lines beneath the boutique's soft lighting. His expression remained cool, but there was a dangerous edge beneath the surface of his calm. "She owns the store," Whitmore said, his voice even and cutting. "She can do whatever she wants." Bradley's fists curled tighter. The muscles in his shoulders stiffened beneath his uniform. A low tremor passed through his frame, the subtle vibration of contained aggression. His gaze snapped toward Whitmore, but Whitmore didn't flinch. His eyes remained cold and steady. Bradley's mouth twitched. His nostrils flared. His chest expanded beneath the sharp rise of his breath. His gaze flicked back toward Jessica. His eyes narrowed beneath the weight of the moment. "You'll regret this," Bradley said. His voice was low and dangerous, threading beneath the heavy silence that blanketed the boutique. Jessica's smile was thin and cold, a faint curl of her lips, barely perceptible. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Doubtful," Jessica said. Her voice was light, almost amused, but the hard edge beneath it sharpened the words into something lethal. Bradley's eyes flashed dangerously. His mouth twisted into something dark and bitter. His hand drifted toward his belt, just a fraction of movement, but Jessica saw it. She saw the reflexive tightening in his muscles, the subtle shift in his weight. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. His stance shifted slightly. A quiet tension slid through his frame. His hands remained at his sides, but the set of his shoulders sharpened beneath the fabric of his suit. Jessica didn't move. Her gaze remained steady. "Leave," Whitmore said. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quiet authority beneath it carved through the heavy air in the boutique like a blade. Bradley's mouth twisted into a hard line. His jaw flexed beneath the strain of his clenched teeth. His gaze remained locked on Jessica's face, his blue eyes burning with cold hostility. His chest rose and fell in sharp, cutting breaths. "Careful," Bradley said softly. His tone sharpened beneath the surface. A thin, dangerous smile curled faintly at the corner of his mouth. "People in your position don't stay on top forever." Jessica's smile sharpened. "I'm not in my position," Jessica said. Her gaze cut through him. "I own it." Bradley's smile faltered. His eyes sharpened. Jessica's gaze remained steady. "Leave," Whitmore repeated, his voice colder now. Bradley's mouth curled. His eyes darkened. His hands flexed at his sides, his knuckles whitening beneath the strain. A sharp silence pressed down on the room. The soft hum of the boutique's music floated beneath it, brittle and thin. The weight of the moment pressed down like glass, stretched too thin, ready to crack beneath the next movement. Bradley's gaze lingered on Jessica's face for a moment too long. His eyes burned with quiet resentment. Then, He stormed toward the door. His boots struck the marble floor in sharp, deliberate strides. His hand shot out toward the glass door. The door's brass handle rattled beneath the force of his grip. Jessica's eyes tracked him as he shoved the door open. The small chime overhead sounded brittle beneath the tension pressing through the boutique. Bradley's back was stiff as he stepped outside. The cold afternoon light washed over his figure, casting his sharp profile in hard relief. He hesitated at the threshold. His gaze flicked toward Jessica one last time. His eyes burned with quiet hostility beneath the flat line of his mouth. Jessica's gaze remained steady. Bradley's jaw flexed. His mouth curled faintly. Then, he stepped outside. The door swung shut behind him with a sharp metallic click. The sound echoed beneath the heavy stillness of the boutique. Jessica's breath steadied. The sharp tension in her chest remained tight beneath her ribs, but the brittle weight of Bradley's presence had begun to dissolve. The boutique remained frozen. The other customers were still watching. The teenage boy near the sunglasses rack still had his phone raised. Jessica could see the red recording light blinking steadily. Jessica's gaze flicked toward the saleswoman behind the counter. The woman's face was pale, her hands still pressed flat against the glass. Her mouth trembled slightly. Jessica's gaze sharpened. "Something wrong?" Jessica asked, her tone smooth and cutting. The saleswoman's mouth opened slightly. No sound emerged. Jessica's smile was thin and sharp. "I didn't think so," Jessica said. Her gaze slid toward Whitmore. His expression remained steady, but Jessica caught the faint, upward curl at the edge of his mouth. The boutique's heavy silence remained unbroken for a moment longer. Jessica's gaze remained sharp beneath the thin curl of her smile. Her breath steadied beneath the slow rise and fall of her chest. Control had shifted. The balance of power had tipped, and they all knew it. Jessica turned toward the saleswoman. The boutique was still unnervingly quiet. The soft hum of classical music floated beneath the brittle tension pressing down on the room. The other customers were still frozen in place, some pretending not to stare, others no longer bothering to hide their interest. The teenage boy near the sunglasses rack still had his phone raised, the faint red glow of the recording light reflecting off the glass display case. Jessica's gaze sharpened as it landed on the saleswoman. The woman stood rigid behind the glass counter. Her hands were pressed flat against the polished surface. The delicate silk of her blouse clung to her frame beneath the harsh glow of the boutique's overhead lights. Her blonde hair remained pulled back into its perfect chignon, but there was a faint sheen of sweat beneath her hairline now, a small crack beneath the carefully polished exterior. Jessica's heels clicked softly against the marble as she closed the distance between them. Her expression remained cold, but her eyes burned beneath the smooth surface. The sharp edge of adrenaline still pulsed beneath her skin. "You didn't try to stop him," Jessica said. Her voice was quiet, steady, the kind of sharp, controlled calm that cut deeper than shouting ever could. The saleswoman's breath hitched. I didn't think..." Jessica's gaze sharpened. "No," Jessica said, cutting across her. Her tone hardened, cold steel beneath the surface. "You didn't think I deserved respect." The saleswoman's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Her eyes widened beneath the weight of Jessica's gaze. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Jessica's gaze didn't waver. "You saw him," Jessica said. Her voice remained low, cutting through the heavy silence. "You saw the way he looked at me. You saw the way he handled me." The saleswoman's throat bobbed. Jessica's tone sharpened. "And you let it happen." The saleswoman's mouth trembled. Her hands curled slightly against the edge of the glass counter. The saleswoman's voice faltered beneath the strain of the moment. "I didn't think..." Jessica's gaze turned sharp and cold. "No," Jessica said. "You didn't." The weight of the statement settled hard between them. The saleswoman's breath sharpened. Her gaze darted toward Whitmore, but Whitmore's expression remained impassive. Cold. Detached. He wasn't going to save her. Jessica's gaze remained steady. "You had a choice," Jessica said. Her tone sharpened at the edges. "You could have spoken up. You could have intervened, but you stood there. You watched." The saleswoman's hands curled into fists at her sides. Her breath quickened. I didn't know what to do," the saleswoman said, her voice thin and trembling. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "You knew exactly what to do," Jessica said coldly. "You chose not to." The saleswoman's face paled. Her breath hitched. Jessica's gaze darkened. "You let him put his hands on me," Jessica said. Her voice dropped into a low, dangerous register. "You let him humiliate me, in front of everyone. And you stood there." The saleswoman's mouth trembled. I'm sorry," the saleswoman whispered. Jessica's smile was thin and cold. "No," Jessica said. "You're not." The saleswoman's breath quickened. Her hands pressed against the counter, her knuckles whitening beneath the strain. Jessica's gaze hardened. "You're fired," Jessica said simply. The words cut through the air like a knife. The saleswoman's face drained of color. Her mouth parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Her eyes widened beneath the weight of Jessica's words. You can't do that," the saleswoman sputtered. A thin line of panic sharpened beneath the surface of her voice. Jessica's smile sharpened. "I just did," Jessica said. The saleswoman's mouth trembled. Her breath hitched. She glanced toward Whitmore again, but Whitmore didn't move. His expression remained steady, detached. His hands remained calmly folded in front of him. The saleswoman's gaze darted toward the other customers. The teenage boy near the sunglasses display still had his phone raised. Jessica could see the faint glow of the recording light reflecting in the glass. A thin murmur passed through the boutique. "She can't really fire her, can she?" a woman near the shoe display whispered. Jessica's gaze sharpened toward the saleswoman. "I can," Jessica said. Her voice was light, almost amused. "Because I own this store now." The saleswoman's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. A faint tremor passed through her hands. Jessica's smile sharpened. "You stood by while that officer humiliated me," Jessica said. Her voice darkened. "And now you think you're going to keep your job?" I didn't mean for that to happen," the saleswoman whispered. Jessica's smile thinned. "You didn't mean for it to happen," Jessica repeated softly. Her tone sharpened beneath the surface. "But you let it happen." The saleswoman's throat bobbed. Jessica's gaze remained cold and steady. "You think that if you stay quiet, you'll stay safe," Jessica said. "That if you side with people like him, it'll protect you." The saleswoman's mouth trembled. Jessica leaned slightly toward her. "But it didn't," Jessica said. Her voice was low and cutting. "Did it?" The saleswoman's breath sharpened. You don't understand," the saleswoman whispered. Jessica's gaze sharpened. "I understand perfectly," Jessica said. Her voice cut through the fragile tension in the boutique like a blade. "You made a choice, and now you get to live with it." The saleswoman's breath hitched. Jessica's gaze remained steady. "You can gather your things," Jessica said. Her voice was smooth and cutting. "Security will escort you out." The saleswoman's eyes widened. Her hands tightened against the edge of the counter. "You can't be serious," the saleswoman whispered. Jessica's gaze remained steady. "I'm not in the habit of repeating myself," Jessica said. The saleswoman's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Her breath quickened beneath the weight of Jessica's gaze. "Go," Jessica said coldly. The saleswoman's hands trembled. A thin line of color drained from her cheeks. Her breath hitched as she stepped back from the counter. Jessica's gaze tracked her as she retreated toward the back of the boutique. The other customers remained frozen, their gazes flicking between Jessica and the saleswoman's stiff, retreating figure. Jessica's breath steadied. Her chest rose and fell beneath the sharp rise of tension pressing down on the boutique. Her gaze shifted toward Whitmore. Whitmore's eyes were dark beneath the surface of his calm expression. A thin curl of satisfaction lifted the corner of his mouth. Jessica's lips curled faintly. The boutique remained silent beneath the weight of Jessica's control. The balance of power had shifted, and Jessica wasn't letting it go. Whitmore chuckled, a low, satisfied sound that cut through the heavy silence of the boutique. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, but there was a weight beneath it. A quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes when power shifts and the right people end up on top. His dark eyes glinted beneath the soft lighting as the corner of his mouth curled into a subtle, knowing smile. Jessica's gaze remained steady. Her pulse was still elevated beneath the surface of her calm exterior, but her breathing had steadied. Her fingers brushed over the smooth leather of the black purse hanging from her arm. The fine Italian stitching pressed coolly beneath her fingertips. It was grounding, a reminder that the moment belonged to her now. Jessica smiled faintly. "I'm tired of this," Jessica said, her tone sharp beneath the surface of her calm exterior. "Tired of being treated like I don't belong." Her gaze sharpened. The weight of the moment sat heavy beneath her ribcage. Whitmore's smile thinned. His dark eyes settled on her with quiet understanding. "You're not wrong," Whitmore said. His voice was low, measured. "But you already knew that." Jessica's grip on the purse tightened slightly. "I've always known that," Jessica said. Her tone sharpened beneath the surface. A hard edge coiled beneath the smoothness of her delivery. "But knowing it and accepting it are two different things." Whitmore's gaze didn't waver. His expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp beneath the surface. He studied her carefully, the weight of his focus pressing down on her like a quiet force. Jessica's lips curled faintly at the corner. "I'm done accepting it," Jessica said. Whitmore's smile deepened slightly. The faint edge of approval settled beneath the surface of his gaze. "So, what's next?" Whitmore asked. His tone remained even, but there was a quiet intensity beneath the question. A subtle challenge, a test of resolve. Jessica's eyes sharpened. The adrenaline beneath her skin hadn't entirely faded yet. It still burned beneath the surface, sharp and electric. The weight of the boutique's silence pressed down around them. The other customers were still watching, some openly, others with poorly concealed glances. The teenage boy near the sunglasses rack had finally lowered his phone, but his gaze remained fixed on Jessica. The saleswoman had disappeared toward the back of the boutique, but Jessica could still feel the lingering weight of her presence like a shadow on the edge of the room. Jessica's smile sharpened. "Change," Jessica said. The words settled heavily between them. Whitmore's gaze sharpened slightly. His smile thinned at the edges. "Change," he repeated. His tone remained neutral, but there was weight beneath it. Jessica's grip on the purse tightened. "I'm not going to keep letting people like him decide where I belong," Jessica said. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. A quiet anger that had been building for years, slowly, steadily, until it sharpened into something lethal. Whitmore's eyes glinted. Jessica's gaze darkened. "I've worked too hard," Jessica said. Her tone sharpened. "I've earned too much to still have to justify why I'm standing here." Whitmore's smile widened faintly. Jessica's chest tightened beneath the weight of her breath. She could still feel Bradley's grip on her wrist, the bruising pressure of his fingers digging into her skin, the cold suspicion in his pale blue eyes, the humiliation of being reduced to a criminal, of being diminished beneath the weight of centuries-old prejudice wrapped in a thin veil of authority. Jessica's gaze darkened. "I'm done explaining myself," Jessica said. Whitmore's gaze remained steady. Jessica's jaw tightened. "They assume we don't belong," Jessica said. Her voice remained low, but the sharp edge beneath it cut through the silence of the boutique. "They think our presence in these spaces is temporary, conditional, a mistake." Whitmore's smile faded into a thin line. His gaze sharpened. Jessica's eyes burned beneath the weight of the memory. "They want us to know that success doesn't erase the lines they've drawn," Jessica said. Her tone darkened. "They want us to believe that, no matter how hard we work, we'll still end up where they think we belong." Whitmore's eyes darkened beneath the surface of his steady exterior. His jaw flexed slightly. Jessica's grip on the purse tightened. "They want to remind us that we're still beneath them," Jessica said. Her tone dropped lower. A quiet, dangerous edge slid beneath the surface. "No matter how far we climb." Whitmore's gaze darkened. Jessica's chin lifted slightly. "But they're wrong," Jessica said. Whitmore's mouth curled faintly at the corner. "Are they?" Whitmore said. Jessica's smile sharpened. "They think success is a gift," Jessica said. Her tone sharpened. "Something they give us permission to have." Whitmore's gaze narrowed. "But it isn't," Jessica said. Her hand slid across the leather of the purse. "It's not a gift," Jessica said, her tone cutting. "It's a weapon." Whitmore's eyes glinted. "And I'm going to use it," Jessica said. Whitmore's smile widened slightly, a thin curl at the edge of his mouth. Jessica's gaze sharpened. "They expect us to stay quiet," Jessica said. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. "They expect us to shrink, to feel grateful for whatever scraps they decide to give us." Whitmore's gaze darkened. "They expect us to stop when they push back," Jessica said. Jessica's eyes sharpened. "They think that money means power," Jessica said. "But that's not true." Whitmore's smile sharpened. Jessica's gaze darkened. "Control," Jessica said. Her voice was low and cold. "That's power." Jessica's grip on the purse tightened. "They don't get to decide where I belong anymore," Jessica said. Her eyes burned. "They don't get to decide how far I can go." Whitmore's smile widened. Jessica's breath steadied beneath the rise and fall of her chest. Her pulse hammered beneath her skin. The heat of the boutique's stale air pressed down around them. Jessica's gaze sharpened. "No more explaining," Jessica said. Her voice was soft, but the steel beneath it was unyielding. Whitmore's smile deepened. "No more asking for permission," Jessica said. Whitmore's eyes glinted. Jessica's gaze hardened. "I'm done letting them decide what I'm allowed to have," Jessica said. Jessica's breath steadied. Her smile sharpened. Whitmore's gaze remained steady. "Change," Jessica said again. Whitmore's smile sharpened beneath the surface of his calm exterior. "That's what they're afraid of," Jessica said. Whitmore's eyes glinted. "And that," Jessica said, "is exactly why I'm going to do it." The boutique remained quiet. The weight of the moment pressed down around them. Jessica's chest rose and fell beneath the sharp weight of the air. Whitmore's smile thinned. His gaze sharpened. Jessica's grip on the purse tightened. It was already starting. Jessica walked to the front of the store. The customers still lingered, whispering. "I'm the new owner," Jessica said, her voice clear and strong. "And things are going to change." A young black woman working behind the counter smiled. Jessica turned toward her. "What's your name?" "Angela," the woman said nervously. "You're the new manager, Angela," Jessica said. Angela's eyes widened. "Really?" Jessica smiled. "Yes." Jessica stepped outside, sunlight warming her skin. Her phone buzzed, a message from her business partner. "The deal closed. We did it." Jessica smiled, slipping her phone into her purse. She'd been humiliated. She'd been underestimated. But now she owned the store. She adjusted her sunglasses, squared her shoulders, and walked down the street with her head held high. This was just the beginning.